The day you stop romanticizing people. Carl Jung. There's a specific kind of pain most people never talk about honestly. It's not the pain of someone hurting you, it's the pain of realizing the person who hurt you never quite existed the way you imagined them to. The version of them you grieved, the one you couldn't stop thinking about, was partly something you built yourself, quietly, automatically. Piece by piece, in the gaps where you didn't have enough information, your mind filled in the missing parts with something warmer than reality. Carl Jung spent decades studying exactly this mechanism, not as a character flaw, but as something built deeply into how human beings relate to one another. And what he discovered is genuinely unsettling, because it means that most people, most of the time, aren't really in a relationship with another person at all. They're in a relationship with a story they wrote about that person. Today, we're going to sit with what happens the day that story collapses and what becomes possible on the other side of it. Segment 1. The mind that fills in the blanks. Here's something worth understanding about how the human mind processes other people. We rarely experience someone as they actually are. We experience them as a combination of who they are, filtered through who we need them to be, shaped by who we're afraid they might be, and filled in wherever the evidence runs thin, with whatever feels most emotionally compelling in the moment. You meet someone confident, and something in you quietly assumes they're loyal. You meet someone who understands you once at the right moment, and suddenly you start building an entire personality around them that was never confirmed. You see someone's best qualities, their warmth in one context, their intelligence in another, and your mind assembles these fragments into a complete, coherent person who may not actually exist in that form. Jung called one dimension of this projection the unconscious tendency to place something from inside ourselves onto the people around us. The qualities we most want to find in someone often say more about what we're hoping for than about what's actually there. And this isn't a sign of weakness or stupidity, it's how human connection works in its early stages. You can't know someone completely at the beginning, so your mind does what it always does when it encounters incomplete information. It fills in the gaps using everything it already knows and hopes for. The trouble isn't that this happens. The trouble is that most people never notice it's happening. Segment 2, Ketso on the moment reality arrives. At some point in almost every significant relationship, reality arrives. Not loudly, not with a dramatic confrontation, it arrives quietly, in a delayed reply that carries a different tone than usual. In disrespect so subtle it takes you days to name what actually bothered you. In a moment of distance that happens precisely when you most needed presence. In the slow, creeping awareness that the version of this person inside your head feels warmer, more consistent, more certain than the actual person standing in front of you. That gap between the person you imagined and the person who actually exists is where most relationship pain lives. Not in betrayal itself, in the collapse of the story that made betrayal unimaginable. You've probably felt this at some point. That specific, disorienting grief that arrives not when someone leaves, but when you start seeing them clearly. And realize the loss had already happened long before the relationship technically ended. What was lost wasn't the person, it was the version of them you had been quietly maintaining in your mind, filling in every blank with something more comfortable than reality. Segment 3, the mask and what's behind it. Jung believed every person carries what he called a persona, the social mask they present to the world, the version of themselves shaped for different contexts, different audiences, different desired outcomes. This isn't conscious deception. In most cases, the person who seems completely loyal in your presence and significantly different in another room isn't necessarily lying to you. They may simply be unconsciously performing whichever version of themselves that particular context rewards. Most people aren't aware of how much of their personality is performance. They genuinely believe they are the mask they're wearing. They've worn it long enough that the distinction between performance and identity has blurred entirely. And this is where Jung's concept of the shadow becomes important. The shadow is the collection of everything a person has pushed out of conscious awareness. The traits, impulses, and qualities they've decided are unacceptable and therefore buried, not eliminated. Buried. The shadow doesn't disappear. It waits and it leaks through the insecurity that flickers beneath someone's charm in an unguarded moment, through the envy that surfaces beneath what presents itself as support, through the control that hides inside what calls itself affection. You've probably seen this if you've known anyone long enough. The moment the mask slips just for a second and something underneath briefly becomes visible. What you glimpse in that second is more accurate than almost anything they've told you deliberately. Segment 4: What patterns actually reveal. After enough of these glimpses, something shifts in how you process people. You stop listening primarily to what someone says, you start watching what they consistently do, especially in the moments when they think the stakes are low, when they're not performing for an audience, when there's nothing particularly to gain from being impressive. Patterns reveal things people spend years carefully concealing. You start noticing that some people only become warm the moment they feel you withdrawing. That respect arrives specifically after distance. That attention increases in direct proportion to how little you're chasing it. This isn't manipulation, necessarily. It's often simply how certain people are wired. By early experience, by what worked in previous relationships, by patterns so automatic they genuinely deny them if confronted. Jung's framework here is useful. He believed that what people deny in themselves tends to get projected outward onto others. The person most convinced of their own honesty is often managing the most carefully constructed image. The person most publicly certain of their loyalty is frequently the one in whom loyalty is most fragile under pressure. This isn't cynicism, it's pattern recognition. And once you start genuinely observing patterns rather than only hearing intentions, something that cannot be unseen comes into focus about how much of social life runs on things people aren't consciously aware of themselves. Segment 5: The relationships that run on denial. Here's something most people resist hearing because it reframes relationships they'd prefer to think of differently. Many relationships don't survive on love. They survive on denial. Denial keeps certain friendships going for years past their honest expiration date. Denial keeps families functioning in configurations that would collapse under direct examination. Denial keeps people emotionally attached to someone who, if assessed clearly, has already communicated through consistent behavior exactly what they think of the relationship. The reason this works is that the human mind is extraordinarily motivated to preserve emotional investments. If you've given years, vulnerability, energy, and genuine care to a relationship, the psychological cost of seeing it clearly and acknowledging what you're actually seeing is sometimes higher than the cost of continuing to rationalize it. So you translate disrespect into misunderstanding. You reframe patterns as circumstances. You tell yourself that the version of them you fell for is the real one, and the version you keep encountering is a temporary aberration. Until one day, you don't anymore. Most relationships don't end when respect disappears. They end when awareness finally refuses to be managed any further. Segment 6: Unconscious Contracts. Pure, uncomplicated connection is rarer than most people want to admit. What people more often seek, and this is usually completely unconscious, is regulation. A way of managing internal feelings they can't comfortably sit with alone. A mirror that reflects back a version of themselves they find tolerable. This is why so many relationships run, beneath their surface, on unspoken psychological contracts. I will make you feel important if you make me feel chosen. I will offer you stability if you promise never to leave. I will support your growth as long as you don't grow past me. Nobody negotiates these contracts explicitly. Most people would deny them if asked, but they operate quietly underneath the emotional surface of almost every long-term relationship. And they reveal themselves with striking clarity when someone changes. Become more successful and notice who goes quiet. Set a boundary where none existed before and notice whose warmth evaporates. Start healing the part of yourself that used to need rescuing, and notice who becomes destabilized rather than happy for you. These reactions aren't random. They're the unconscious contract reacting to being violated. Because the relationship wasn't built around who you are. It was built around the specific role you were playing. Segment 7. Looking at yourself. Here is where this conversation asks something genuinely difficult of you. Because everything described so far, the projections, the masks, the unconscious contracts, the shadow leaking through behavior, applies not just to the people around you, it applies to you. This is the part of Jungian psychology most people quietly skip past because it's significantly more comfortable to observe these mechanisms in others than to sit with them honestly in yourself. But Jung was clear. Seeing the darkness in others is only half the work. Often, it's the easier half. The full journey requires turning the same honesty inward. Catching yourself, enjoying someone's failure, and staying with that feeling long enough to understand it, rather than immediately explaining it away. Noticing when you withhold warmth as a form of subtle control. Recognizing the moments when your honesty is actually cruelty with better branding. Most people have some version of an unconscious contract they offer the people close to them. Most people have a shadow that influences their behavior in ways they'd prefer not to examine directly. Most people under the right pressure, discover that their moral certainty is more fragile than they'd predicted. This isn't a condemnation, it's an invitation to a more accurate self understanding than most people ever develop. Because awareness that only travels outward eventually curdles into cynicism. Awareness that turns inward, with genuine honesty, not self punishment, becomes something rarer and more useful. Segment 8: The dangerous temptation of detachment. There's a stage many people reach after this kind of awareness develops that's worth naming directly because it's a trap. It feels like clarity. It presents itself as intelligence, but it's actually a defense mechanism wearing the costume of wisdom. It's the stage where someone decides that because they can see through social performance, because they understand projection and masks and unconscious contracts, the logical conclusion is to trust no one, expect nothing, and view all emotional warmth with automatic suspicion. Cold detachment dressed up as enlightenment. Jung was explicit about this. The goal of genuine self-awareness was never cynicism. It was never a kind of psychological armoring against the messiness of real connection. The goal was consciousness, the ability to see people and situations clearly, without the distortion of projection, without the false comfort of denial, while still remaining genuinely human in how you respond to what you see. That balance is harder than either extreme. Naive romanticism is easy. Cold detachment is easy. Seeing people clearly, their fragmentation, their shadow, their unconscious patterns, and still choosing deliberate, honest engagement with them anyway, that is the actual work. Our take. So here's what the day you stop romanticizing people actually feels like once it arrives. It doesn't feel like the end of something. It feels more like the beginning of seeing. Not optimistically, not pessimistically, just accurately. You become slower to trust, but deeper when you do, because the trust you extend is no longer based on a story you wrote. It's based on what you've actually observed over time in the moments that cost something to be honest in. You become harder to manipulate because the projections that made you vulnerable to certain people begin losing their grip on you. And perhaps most importantly, you stop needing the people around you to be better than they actually are in order to feel safe, because your sense of self is no longer built on the quality of the story you've told about them. Jung believed the greatest danger in human relationships was never that someone else could deceive you. It was that your own loneliness, your own hope, your own unexamined need could deceive you first. The day you understand that is the day reality, for all its difficulty, finally starts working in your favor. If this gave you language for something you've been sitting with, that's exactly what this channel is for. Subscribe to Booked Wisdom, because the clearer you see people, the harder it becomes to be deceived by the stories you tell about them.